That was good.
Amen.
Yeah, that was really good. Thank y'all. Thank y'all. Now I'm supposed to come up behind that and preach. Preach on to that's right. This morning I want to look at, are we filled with faith or are we fruitless? Are we filled with faith or are we fruitless? I want to look at Mark chapter 11, verses 12 through 25. But before we get to that passage, I want us to look at something else. I want to look at a story that Jesus told. I want us to look at Luke chapter 13, verses 6 through 9. Will you please turn to Luke chapter 13, verses 6 through 9. I want to read that first before we get into our main passage. So when you find the book of Luke, chapter 13, verses 6 through 9, would you please stand in reverence and honor of reading God's word. The words will be on the screen also as well. This is Luke chapter 13. This is verses 6 through 9. This is the New Living Translation. So, as God's word says, and here in Luke chapter 13, it says, Then Jesus told this story. A man planted a fig tree in his garden, and came again and again to see if there was any fruit on it. But he was always disappointed. Finally, he said to his gardener, I've waited 3 years. There hasn't been a single fig. Cut it down. It's taken up space in the garden. The gardener answered, Sir, give it one more chance. Leave it another year, and I'll give it a special attention. Plenty of fertilizer. If we get figs next year, fine. Not, you can cut it down. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, thank you so much for this time that you've given us, Lord, to come into your house. Lord, at this time, Lord, speak through me. Lord, thank you for the message that you have laid on my heart this morning. Lord, thank you for allowing me to stand here, Lord. Thank you for the blessing, the privilege of letting me stand here, Lord. And in honor of you, Lord, use me this morning. Use it for your glory. Lord, thank you for allowing us to have the word this morning, hold it in our hands. And thank you for this fresh message, Lord, from your word. I pray all these things in your wonderful and holy name. Amen. Please be seated. Now, this is one of the parables that Jesus told. And the thing about this story is, it leaves us wondering, what's going to happen next? Does the tree get cut down or not? Will it get cut down? Now, keep that parable in mind as we do now turn to our main passage, which is Mark chapter 11, verses 12 to 25. As we started last week, remember we started with the Holy Week, going through that week that changed everything. And today we're Monday, the day after that Sunday, where last week we looked at Jesus coming into Jerusalem. Remember, and as he came, everybody was praising him. Everybody was, hailing his praises. Everybody was, Hosanna, praise God in the highest. They were all cheering him on, right? Now, I want to point out a very particular verse before we get into our main passage. Verse 11 simply tells us about the rest of Jesus' Sunday. Now, there is a very particular thing about this verse. This is something we normally would look over. Chapter 11, or verse 11 says, So Jesus came to Jerusalem, and he went into the temple. After looking around very carefully, he looked around very carefully at everything. He left because it was late in the afternoon. Then he returned to Bethany with the 12 disciples. Now, there's something about that verse that we always look over, but there's something very important in that verse, too. And we'll get to that in a minute. This brings us to our passage in verse 12. Also to our first point, which is Jesus reveals the fruitless tree, which is what this passage is about. We're going to be looking at verses 12 through 14 first, and then I want to skip down to verses 20 and 21. So, chapter 11, verses 12 through 14, first, it says, The next morning, as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. He noticed a fig tree in full leaf a little way off, so he went over to see if he could find any figs, but they were only leaves because it was too early in the season for fruit. And then Jesus said to the tree, May no one ever eat your fruit again. And the disciples heard him say it. Now skip down to verses 20 and 21. And this is where Mark continues the story. It says, you look at verse 20-21, it says, the next morning as they passed by the fig tree, he had cursed it. And the disciples noticed it had withered from the roots up. Peter remembered what Jesus had said to the tree on the previous day and exclaimed, look, Rabbi, the fig tree that you cursed has withered and died. Now, if you notice in this story, the whole thing started with something very natural, something that all of us go through. Jesus was hungry. He's hungry. So he sees this tree, and now this is a very common tree in Israel. It's it's mentioned a lot in the book in the Old Testament. It's a very common tree. It's a fig tree, and the thing that's interesting about the fig tree is the fruit grows first before the leaves. So if there is leaves on the tree, that usually means that there's fruit. So this tree, this fig tree, had the appearance to Jesus that, okay, this tree has fruit. I'm hungry. I want some fruit. I'm going to go over and get some. Well, this tree only had the appearance of fruit. It didn't have any fruit. Now this is just before the Passover, and Jesus would have known that this was not the season for figs. He would have known that. And he is walking along, he's hungry. And this is not a season for figs, as Mark points out. But the presence of leaves on this tree would have pointed out the fact that there should have been fruit. So, seeing the leaves, Jesus walks over and he's looking for fruit. He doesn't find any. So what does he start doing? He starts doing something very unusual. He starts talking to the tree. But he's not talking to the tree, is he? He's not talking to the tree. He is talking so that the disciples will hear him. And he has given them a prophetic lesson. Talking to the tree. He's announcing the destruction of this tree. But it's all for the disciples and their ears. But why? Why is Jesus doing that? Why is Jesus doing this for the sake of the disciples? He's doing this to give a symbolic lesson to the disciples. So whenever Jesus did something, whenever he told a story, there was always something more symbolic behind it. Whenever he did something, there was always something more meaningful behind it of what he was doing. So what is the symbolism here? What is the symbolism here? If you will look at point number 2. Jesus reveals fruitless people. Jesus reveals the fruitless people. Now I want to look at verses 15 through 19. And this is going to answer our question right here of this symbolic lesson. So in verses 15 through 19, it says, when they arrived back in Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple, and he began to drive out the people buying and selling animals for sacrifices. He knocked over the tables of the money changers and the chairs of those selling doves, and he stopped everyone from using the temple as a marketplace. And he said to them, the scriptures declare my temple will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have turned it into a den of thieves. When the leading priests and teachers of religious law heard what Jesus had done, they began planning on how to kill him. But they were afraid of him because the people were so amazed at his teaching. They were amazed. They were afraid of him. So that evening, Jesus and the disciples left the city. So, what's the issue here? The chief priests and the leaders were using the temple to make profit. Now, usually what happened, you always needed animals to make sacrifices, right? And so, what they would do is, either somebody would bring an animal, or if there was, travelers that didn't have one, they could go to the temple and they could buy an animal for sacrifice. But what the chief priests and the elders started doing was they were taking, animals and saying, oh, there's something wrong with the one you brought. You got to buy one of ours. There's something wrong with yours. It's got a bad leg. Look at ours, So they were saying that, Okay, you've got a bad animal. You got to buy one of ours. Now, also, too, at the same time, anybody that came in town that was traveling, they had to have, Jewish money to spend. So they would have to go to the temple to exchange money. And so the priests, what they would do is they would charge a little bit extra, what's called a temple tax, for exchanging money. So they were making money hand over fist with all this stuff going on. Now, if you remember, we read that passage back in chapter 11, or verse 11. That night, Jesus looked around, very careful at everything. He got upset. He had to spend all night stewing on everything that he saw. He looked carefully at everything and saw everything that was going on. Saw all this stuff that was going on with the temple, with the chief priests, selling. He was upset and stewed on it all night. He's not killing this and making this fig tree wither because he lost his cool. He didn't act impulsively and say, I'm just going to wither this fig tree. No, he was upset. He was going to use this as a lesson for the disciples. Jesus found the temple. He found the temple and the leaders fruitless. They had the appearance of being religious. They had the appearance of being a temple for worship and prayer. They weren't doing the right things. Jesus got upset. It had the whole appearance of worship and being a place of prayer and coming to a place of repentance. But it had no fruit. It had become a place of profit and of just following through the motions, becoming a place of rituals, following through the motions, just going through the motions. Jesus was giving them a lesson on fruitless people, of being fruitless. Just as the fig tree withered, Jesus said he would, prophesy that the temple will be destroyed in a couple of years. And as we know, as history does confirm, the temple would be destroyed in a number of years. So just like the parable of the fruitless fig tree, we see that the Israelites were doing the same thing. They were lacking the fruit. But Jesus is not done teaching yet. Brings us to point number 3. Jesus gives a fruitful lesson. Look again at verses 20 through 25. Look again. It says, the next morning as they passed by the fig tree he had cursed, the disciples noticed it had withered from the roots up. Peter remembered what Jesus had said to the tree on the previous day and exclaimed, look, Rabbi, the fig tree you cursed has withered and died. Then Jesus said to the disciples, have faith in God. I tell you the truth, you can say to this mountain, may you be lifted up and thrown into the sea, and it will happen. But you must really believe it will happen and have no doubt in your heart. Have no doubt. I'll tell you, you can pray for anything, and if you believe that you received it, it will be yours. But when you are praying, first forgive anyone that you're holding a grudge against, so that your Father in heaven will forgive your sins too. So, in this lesson, as we see that Jesus is calling for true worship from his people. As he's announcing the destruction of this withered fig tree, and he has just saw, and all of them just saw what happened in the temple. Now he's calling for true worship from his people. Have faith in God. Have faith. Jesus is teaching them about having faith. And he's saying, hey, you have faith and don't doubt. Move a mountain. Now, is this literally what Jesus is talking about? No. Because what has Jesus said before? That, for those that come behind him, we can do greater things, right? Didn't he say that? Didn't he tell us that we are going to do greater things than him? Does that mean that we're going to be able to go out there and move a mountain? No, we'll be able to do greater things than that. I'm talking about life-changing, heart-changing people. changing the hearts and the lives of people. That's something so much greater than moving mountains. Having the faith to believe that we can change the lives of people out here in this community and in our lives of ourselves. That He can come in, Jesus can come in and change our whole life. Change our hearts. Change the way that we look at people. The way that we look at our community. Look at it with love. That's the kind of mountain that Jesus is talking about. Having the faith to move those kind of mountains. To do the impossible. Jesus tells them what kind of faith you need to have. Mountain-moving faith. Have faith in God. I tell you the truth. You can say this mountain, may you be lifted up and thrown into the sea, and it will happen. But you must really believe and have faith, and it happen, and have no doubt. We should want to see our faith verbalized in our prayers. We should want and desire our faith to be verbalized in our prayers. We can do the impossible here at this church and in our community. How do we see the impossible done? Have faith in God and pray. Pray against all odds. Pray against all odds. The temple was to be a house of prayer for all nations, but it had become a den of thieves. Jesus was talking about their lack of fruitlessness, their fruitlessness and their failures, and saying, look past that. Have faith in God. You can do the impossible. You can change hearts. You can change lives. You can see people come, all different kind of situations in their lives. And they can come and they can find Christ. Have their whole life changed. Have their heart changed. We can do the same thing here today. In our community today. If we would just reach out and love. See lives changed in our community. We can see our church change. Our church grow. We can see things, through Jesus' eyes. We can pray against all odds. Believe and have faith that our prayers will be answered. Because that's what Jesus says. Jesus says our prayers will be answered if we have faith. What are we called to do? We're called to walk by faith, not by sight, right? Walk by faith. Jesus is calling us to preach a message of love that is so radical, so different than anything that anybody's ever heard before. And I'm talking about the Sermon on the Mount. To die daily to ourselves, take up our cross and follow Him. Show grace and mercy and love and forgiveness to others. To see all people brought to a relationship with Christ. And I'm talking about all people. Even our people we consider our enemies. I'm talking about white, black, yellow, red. All people. Change lives. That's what Jesus was talking about. Changing lives, changing hearts. We can trust God for doing the impossible. Having faith. Are we filled with faith this morning? Or when Jesus comes back, is He going to find us fruitless? My prayer is that when Jesus comes back one day, He's coming back one day, even though there's a lot of doubts out there, when He comes back, He finds us filled with faith and working for Him, doing His work, doing His service, all in light of the things that He's done for us, all because of the sacrifice that He's done on our, for us and our part. Will you stand with me this morning? Are we filled with faith? Or are we fruitless?